well in Methodist religious circles. So there's a bestseller which says that this man is not some animal, some subhuman who should be enslaved. No, he's a person, he has a family, he has all these things that you read about. And his enslavement is not, he's sort of in some deep emotional sense wrong. That's kind of the sense that you get from this book. So, 89 is Equiano. 95, I'm going to show you some pictures, another really important book. John Gabriel Stedman, who's a soldier who goes to the Dutch colony of Suriname, where there had just been a slave revolt, and it's brutally, horribly put down. And even for slaves that weren't involved in the slave revolt, they're treated horribly. And, adds another dimension, the engravings for this book, of these cruelties, and I'll show you some of these in a moment, were done by no less than William Blake, the great poet and engraver. And this also became a bestseller. So, and in addition, Clarkson's book that you read parts of, and its famous illustrations become more and more widely circulated. So now we have a communicative base that acts over large distance through these visual and literary texts. Then in 1807, the importation of slaves is made illegal to British colonies. In 1808, it's made illegal to the United States. You have a very short document in your text in 1815. In principle, though only in principle, not in fact, the European powers who end the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna declare that they're opposed to slavery. Remember, you have a little paragraph in your reader which says this. 1833, slavery is abolished in British colonies. 48 in France. 1863 in the United States. Now, as you know, and we'll come back to this in a moment, this was not sort of smooth sailing. And Dred Scott, in some sense, which you read parts of, is explicitly sort of, in some sense, at an opposite pole from Equiano. They say that Scott is actually subhuman. And consequently, you'll never enjoy the protections of a United States citizen. So, it's not smooth sailing, but this is roughly the story I want to tell. So we go from where slavery is commonplace to where slavery is actually not so commonplace. In fact, it becomes increasingly not acceptable and eventually abolished. So that's a rather remarkable story, and we want to see that's kind of be the early first humanitarian movement, and we see how this happened. Okay, so now I want to talk about why should those not within our circle of the we matter. And then we'll begin with what I said, the narrative expansion of the circle of the we, of those who matter, using slavery and abolition as an example. So the key feature of the anti-slavery narrative, and I want to suggest to you of all humanitarian narratives, I'm speaking to you now about a general form, is facts. Facts are the core of the narrative. Something really happened. We have evidence for it happened. Our narrator assures us it's true. He or she saw it, or he or she spoke with someone who saw it and is reliable. We have in writing. We have a document that records the suffering of a victim. We have the voices of the victim themselves, the Equianos. So if you go on the website of almost any humanitarian or human rights organization now, you'll find the voices of the people who suffer. You'll find a set of fact sheets. So that's crucial. Now, what examples do you have of this in your reading? Well, Clarkson is a really good example of, you might want to call this, passion for facts at the core of humanitarian narrative. Clarkson, was a highly educated man. He was an undergraduate at Cambridge, where he wrote this brilliant thesis. He knew about doing research. And to write his thesis, he did a great deal of research, and subsequently, the larger version, he did even more research. He traveled probably tens of thousands of miles around England. He interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of people. He read every piece of legislation that he could find. He knew a great deal about Africa. He actually got interested in African art and became fascinated with the idea that people who were now enslaved and treated as subhuman produce such beautiful things, and this has to be wrong as well. So Clarkson was deeply immersed and deeply learned in the facts of this movement. So let me just show you this very, very, very famous picture. In fact, you probably saw this this picture in high school. And it's really a kind of remarkable picture, not just for the history of humanitarianism, but in some sense the history of social sciences and a visual representation. So it's the slave ship Brooks, and it's the slave ship Brooks. It wasn't just a slave ship, and if you count the number of bodies on here, you'll find there are 454 bodies. Now, the slave ship Brooke actually never did carry 454 bodies. In one of the earlier expeditions that the slave ship Brooke did to Africa, it carried 609 people. So this is not the slave ship Brooks at its maximum capacity, quotation marks. But in fact, in 1788, there was an act passed which regulated the cargo of slave ships. Now that act in turn was the consequence of a large number of investigations of the tonnage of ships, of how much room people supposedly needed, of how much water needed to be on the boat, and so forth and so on. So the act regulating the number of slaves on a ship like the Brooks was a result of this world of facts. And what Clarkson is so brilliantly telling you here is that, look, you take this piece of legislation, which is supposed to be ameliorating the condition of slaves, and this is what you would get if we followed its regulations. So this is, if you want, a kind of brilliant statistical visualization. Right? He's saying, let's take the point. Yes, 485 slaves are allowed on this boat. That's what it would look like. And it's clearly horrible. So you add this picture then to the stories of the suffering of the Middle Passage, and you have a sense then of what this was really like. So 2 points here, and again, it develops some of the, I hope, begins to answer some of the questions that you had with my more abstract formulation. That facts are central, the abuse must be real, it's true, it's been represented accurately, it's been represented powerfully. Now, what are we supposed to do with these facts? Now, I could give you other versions of how these facts are developed. Let me give you one more, which will then speak to a picture I'm going to show you in a moment. In 1781, a slaver, someone on the way from Africa to Jamaica, hit some storms off the coast of Jamaica, and he thought that his boats were in trouble, and there were a bunch of sick slaves on the boat, and he thought, well, the solution to my problem is to throw them overboard. So in a series of days, it took 3 days, he threw 121 people overboard. Famous controversy called, the boat was named the Zong, Z-O-N-G. He just threw them overboard. So why shouldn't you throw them overboard? It's fine to throw them overboard, right? Because who cares? And you can collect the money for them from insurance, right? There was maritime insurance in those days. So he comes home, and the captain and the group of people who supported the captain, and he asked the insurers to pay for his loss of cargo. And the insurers say, you can't claim a loss for cargo if you willfully kill 121 people by throwing them overboard. And they say, sure we can. They're cargo, and it makes no difference. And it went to an appeals court. The state actually had an interest in the appeals court, and the state famously held that this should be treated no differently than as if the owners of the captain of the ship had thrown 121 horses overboard, for which he would be insured. This went up on in a complicated set of appeals, and Lord Mansfield actually ruled, the same guy as before, ruled not on the sort of grounds of slavery, but ruled that, look, the reason these guys were sick and that you were in this situation is not that there was some super emergency. The reason is that you just didn't manage the voyage well. You had plenty of water. You weren't good at managing the water intake of these slaves, and you're in trouble because you just mismanaged your cargo. So no, the insurance company doesn't need to pay, but not